Ancient cities disappeared in a single day, leaving no enemy to blame. The ground itself opened up, and the sky rained fire. This video uncovers 20 natural disasters that shattered empires and rewrote human destiny. You will discover how a volcano in the Mediterranean inspired the legend of Atlantis, and why a slow-moving drought erased one of the world's first great cultures from the map. We will see how the fate of Rome and the Maya were sealed not by armies, but by climate and disease. By the end, you will understand history as a story shaped by the planet's raw power, a perspective that changes everything. What forgotten story of survival speaks to you most? Their world was one of constant negotiation with the forces of nature. Without satellites to predict storms or deep storage granaries to outlast famine, ancient civilizations lived on a razor's edge. Their survival was a direct result of their ability to read the subtle signs of the earth and sky, to know when the rains would come and where the game would migrate. This profound dependency shaped every aspect of their culture. They built their cities along fertile river valleys, knowing that one season of failed floods could mean starvation. They developed complex religious rituals to appease gods they believed controlled the weather and the ground beneath their feet. A single prolonged drought, a volcanic eruption hundreds of miles away, or a sudden shift in temperature patterns were not mere inconveniences. They were existential threats capable of unraveling the entire social fabric. This foundational vulnerability is the key to understanding why the disasters we are about to explore did not just damage buildings or claim lives. They shattered worldviews, erased languages from history, and forced humanity to adapt or perish. The first catastrophe on our list demonstrates this with terrifying clarity, beginning with a civilization whose end was so sudden it was preserved in a single, horrifying moment. A colossal volcanic detonation shattered the island of Thura around the year 1600 before the Common Era. This was not a simple mountain letting off steam. It was a planet-altering event, one of the most violent explosions humanity has ever witnessed. The eruption sent a towering column of ash and pumice high into the atmosphere, while the center of the island collapsed into the sea, creating the vast caldera we see today at Santorini. But the immediate aftermath was even more destructive. Tsunami waves, towering walls of water generated by the volcano's collapse, radiated outward across the eastern Mediterranean Sea. They slammed into the northern coast of Crete, the heartland of the sophisticated Minoan civilization. The Minoans were a maritime power, their wealth and influence built upon their mighty fleet of trading ships. In a single day, those same ships harbored along the coast were utterly destroyed. The tsunamis scoured ports and coastal settlements, washing away the very foundation of Minoan economic and military strength. Then came the ash. A thick blanket of volcanic debris fell across Crete, smothering fertile fields and poisoning the soil for generations. This was a 1-2 punch from which the Minoans could not recover. Their society, so dependent on the sea and the land, was crippled. Trade routes collapsed, famine likely set in, and their political power evaporated. The vibrant, artistic culture that once dominated the Aegean began a rapid and irreversible decline. This sudden fall of a great civilization left a power vacuum, one that was eagerly filled by the Mycenaeans from the Greek mainland. The Mycenaeans adopted and adapted much from the Minoans, from their writing system to their architectural styles, but they forged a new, more warlike culture that would become the bedrock of classical Greece. It is almost impossible not to see the echoes of this real-world catastrophe in one of history's most enduring legends, the story of Atlantis, a powerful, advanced island kingdom thriving in the middle of the sea that vanishes in a single day and night of fire and water. The parallels are striking, suggesting that the Thura eruption was so profoundly traumatic its memory was woven into myth for 1,000 years. This disaster shows us that the planet itself can be the ultimate author of history, erasing one chapter to allow another to begin. And as one civilization fell in the Mediterranean, another on the opposite side of the world was facing a silent, creeping threat far slower than a volcano, but just as deadly. Far from the volcanic fires of the Mediterranean, a different kind of disaster was unfolding, one that moved with the slow and silent force of a changing sky. The great cities of the Indus Valley, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were marvels of ancient urban planning. They boasted sophisticated drainage systems, standardized bricks, and orderly streets laid out in precise grids, a testament to a society of remarkable organization and harmony. Yet by around 1900 before the Common Era, these bustling centers were not sacked or burned. They were simply being emptied, their grand structures abandoned to the dust. The enemy was not an army, but a fundamental shift in the very climate that had nurtured them. For centuries, their survival was tethered to the reliable rhythms of the monsoon, the seasonal rains that filled the great Gaga-Hakra river system and watered their vast fields of wheat and barley. But then the rains began to fail. Scientific evidence from ancient lakebeds and sediment cores tells a story of a prolonged and devastating drought. The monsoons weakened, their patterns shifting southward, and the life-giving Gaga-Hakra River, the backbone of their civilization, gradually shriveled into a series of seasonal streams and then into sand. Imagine the slow, agonizing dread that must have settled over these cities. One year, the harvest is poor. The next, it is worse. The water levels in the wells drop season after season. There is no single cataclysmic event to point to, no day of destruction. Instead, there is a creeping exhaustion of the land. The social contract that held this complex urban culture together, based on surplus food and centralized authority, began to fray. Without enough food to support a large, non-farming population of artisans, priests, and administrators, the system collapsed from within. People had no choice but to leave. They dispersed in small groups, migrating east and south in search of reliable water, reverting to a simpler, rural way of life. The knowledge of city planning, of writing, and of large-scale trade slowly faded away. This was not a violent end, but a quiet unraveling. The Indus Valley civilization did not fall, it simply faded, its people scattering like seeds before a relentless, invisible wind. This silent disaster forces us to confront a chilling truth. A civilization can be exquisitely designed to solve every human problem, from waste management to social order, and still be utterly defenseless against a change in the wind. And as we will see, this pattern of a stable climate giving way, of the very weather turning against a society, is a thread that runs through the collapse of some of history's most powerful empires. Sometimes the greatest catastrophes are not a single event, but a cascade of failures. Around 1200 before the Common Era, the interconnected world of the Eastern Mediterranean, a vibrant network of empires built on bronze and trade, began to shatter. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Mycenaean kingdoms in Greece, and even the mighty new kingdom of Egypt all faced a crisis so profound it erased an entire age from the map. This was not the work of one disaster, but a perfect storm. A severe, prolonged drought gripped the region, crippling agriculture from the Aegean to the Levant. Famine followed, weakening populations and straining the social order. To make matters worse, evidence suggests a period of intense seismic activity, as earthquakes damaged vital cities and infrastructure. This combination of environmental stresses created a tinderbox of desperation and instability. Into this power vacuum sailed a mysterious and terrifying force, recorded in Egyptian hieroglyphs simply as the Sea Peoples. We still do not know exactly who they were, where they came from, or what ultimately drove them from their homes. They may have been a confederation of displaced peoples, pirates, and warriors, themselves victims of the same widespread climate chaos. What is certain is that they moved with devastating force, attacking coastlines, sacking cities, and severing the delicate trade routes that supplied the empires with tin and copper, the very ingredients for bronze. The Hittite Empire, cut off from its trade partners and facing internal collapse, vanished completely. In Egypt, Pharaoh Ramesses III fought them to a standstill in a great naval battle, a victory that saved his kingdom from conquest but left it impoverished and broken. The entire intricate system of palaces, scribes, and international diplomacy collapsed. Literacy, in many places, was lost for centuries. The great trading networks dissolved, and a dark age descended over the region. It was a reset on a civilizational scale. From the ashes of this multifaceted catastrophe, smaller, isolated communities slowly rebuilt, eventually giving rise to the world of iron and the classical city-states of Greece. This collapse teaches a brutal lesson about interconnectedness. A drought in one land can lead to famine in another, which can spawn migration that topples an empire a continent away. It is a chain reaction we have seen before, and as our journey continues, we will see it again. The chain of collapsing empires reveals a terrifying pattern of nature's indifference, but some disasters struck with such focused fury they became legendary warnings. On a winter night in the year 373 before the Common Era, the wealthy Greek city of Helike simply ceased to exist. As a principal center for the worship of Poseidon, the god of the sea and earthquakes, Helike's fate was a cruel and cosmic irony. A massive earthquake first shook the region, toppling its magnificent temples and homes. But the horror was not over. As the ground convulsed, the entire coastline along the Corinthian Gulf subsided, and the sea rushed in to claim the ruins. By morning, where a thriving political and cultural hub had stood, there was only water. Every single inhabitant was lost. The city had not just been damaged. It had been physically erased, its memory swallowed by the very element its patron god controlled. For the ancient Greeks, this was far more than a geological tragedy. It was a profound divine punishment, a lesson from the gods about the limits of human pride. The event was so shocking it was documented by writers like Strabo and Pausanias, who reported that for years afterward, the bronze statue of Poseidon located in the sunken city could be seen gleaming eerily beneath the waves, a ghostly monument to a vanished people. Helike's destruction demonstrated a terrifying finality. An earthquake could kill a population, but a tsunami could erase their homes so completely that future generations would question if it ever existed at all. This total annihilation of place, the removal of a city from the map and the landscape, is a fate that would befall others, leaving behind only questions and a deep, lingering dread of the ground giving way. The rhythm of the Nile was the heartbeat of Egypt. For centuries, its predictable annual flood brought life-giving silt and water to the valley, creating a surplus of grain that fueled the most powerful state on earth. This was the era of the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders, when pharaohs commanded the labor of thousands to erect monuments to their own divinity. Their authority was absolute because it was believed they maintained Maat, the cosmic order itself, which included ensuring the Nile's bounty. Then, around 2200 before the Common Era, the rhythm faltered. A series of catastrophically low floods, possibly linked to a distant shift in monsoon patterns, left the river a trickle in its vast bed. The fields baked dry in the sun, and the granaries, once overflowing, stood empty. Famine gripped the land. You can almost hear the silence where there should have been the sound of rushing water, and see the desperation in the eyes of a people who watched their god-king fail to command the very river. This was more than an agricultural disaster. It was a theological catastrophe. If the pharaoh was a god, why could he not make the Nile rise, the foundation of their entire society, built on the promise of divine order, crumbled into dust? The result was a century of chaos known as the First Intermediate Period. Central authority evaporated, and Egypt fractured into a collection of warring petty states. The art of the time depicts shocking scenes of starvation and social inversion, where the poor rebelled and the elite were brought low. The Great Pyramid building age was over, not conquered by an external enemy, but broken from within by the failure of a single river. This profound dependence on a single, unpredictable water source was a vulnerability shared by other great river civilizations. As we will soon see, the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates, faced its own existential crisis born from the very waters that gave it life. The very water that built Mesopotamia would become its poison. In the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians and Akkadians engineered one of humanity's greatest innovations, a vast network of canals and irrigation ditches that turned arid plains into fields of golden grain. This system of artificial rivers allowed their cities to flourish, supporting dense populations of artisans, priests, and soldiers. For a time, it seemed they had conquered the desert itself. But their brilliant solution contained a hidden, creeping flaw. In a land with little rainfall, the water they channeled onto their fields had to evaporate, and when it did, it left behind all the mineral salts it had carried from the rivers. With no natural drainage to flush these salts away, they accumulated in the soil season after season, year after year. At first, the effect was negligible, a tiny price for such abundance. But over centuries, the salt built into a toxic crust, a white film that choked the life from the very earth they depended on. You can trace this slow-motion crisis in the clay tablets the Sumerians left behind. Early records show that farmers were growing wheat, but wheat is a sensitive crop. It cannot tolerate high salinity. As the soil grew saltier, wheat harvests began to fail. The response was a desperate shift to a hardier grain, barley. While barley could withstand the saltier conditions, its yields were lower and it was less nutritious. It was a clear downgrade, a sign of a civilization compromising its own diet just to survive. Over time, even the barley struggled. The once legendary fertility of the southern Mesopotamian plains withered. What was once the breadbasket of an empire could no longer feed its own people. This environmental decay struck directly at the economic and political heart of the early city-states. A kingdom's power was measured in grain, and with dwindling harvests that power evaporated. The social order built on agricultural surplus began to crumble. This created a slow but decisive power shift. The center of gravity for Mesopotamian civilization gradually moved north to cities like Babylon and later Assyria. These regions had better natural drainage and more rainfall, which helped to flush salts from the soil. The empires that rose there learned from the mistakes of their southern predecessors, but the south never fully recovered. Its great cities, the very cradles of writing and law, were eventually abandoned to the desert, their fields rendered barren by the salt of their own success. This was a disaster of unintended consequences. It was not a volcano or an earthquake, but a quiet, insidious process born from their own brilliant technology. The canals they built to ensure their survival ultimately undermined it. proving that a civilization's greatest strength can, over time, become its most profound weakness. And as we will see, this theme of a society being tested by the environmental repercussions of its own success is one that echoes across the ancient world. A slow-burning crisis on the northern steppes would ultimately batter the gates of imperial China. For generations, the nomadic Qing New Confederation had lived in a delicate balance with the vast grasslands of Central Asia, their lives and livestock dependent on its rhythms. But during the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, that balance was shattered. A prolonged and intense drought desiccated the land, turning pastures to dust and shrinking the vital water sources their vast herds of horses and sheep needed to survive. Faced with starvation, these formidable pastoralists had only one direction to move: south, toward the settled, wealthy, and vulnerable towns of the Han dynasty. This was not merely a migration, it was a force of nature given human form, a desperate tide of skilled horsemen crashing against China's northern frontier. The Han emperors found themselves in a constant, draining state of war. The Xingnu were not a conventional army to be met in a single, decisive battle. They were a shadow enemy, striking with lightning raids to seize food, supplies, and captives before melting back into the arid plains. To counter this relentless pressure, the Han dynasty was forced to pour a staggering portion of its wealth into its military. Treasury reserves meant for public works and palaces were funneled into maintaining vast, permanent armies along the border. The cost of feeding, equipping, and paying these soldiers bled the empire's finances, creating a fiscal crisis that weakened the central government from within. This existential threat demanded more than just armies, it demanded a wall. The Han response was to fortify and massively expand the Great Wall, turning it from a series of disconnected ramparts into a continuous, heavily garrisoned barrier. This monumental project was a direct and desperate reaction to the climate-driven migrations from the north. It was an attempt to build a line against the creeping consequences of a distant drought. The struggle against the Xingnu did more than just drain the treasury. It fundamentally warped Chinese foreign policy and worldview for centuries, fostering a deep-seated suspicion of the northern barbarians and a focus on defensive fortification that would echo through Chinese history. The fate of one of the world's most advanced empires was being written not in its own court, but by the failing rains on a distant steppe. This domino effect, where a climate disaster in one region triggers a geopolitical crisis in another, is a powerful reminder of our interconnected world. And as we will see, this pattern of pressure from the edges, of nomadic peoples set in motion by a changing environment, would bring about the end of another legendary empire. While the Romans were fortifying their frontiers against human enemies, a far deadlier foe was already moving silently within their own borders. The plague of Cyprian, named for the bishop who documented its horrors, swept across the Roman Empire beginning around 250 of the Common Era. It was a pestilence of such ferocity that it did not just kill people, it attacked the very pillars of the state. Contemporary accounts describe a relentless sickness, with victims suffering high fevers, putrid diarrhea, and blackened gangrene in their extremities. The streets of cities like Rome and Carthage were filled with the dead and dying, so many that the traditional rituals of burial collapsed and bodies were piled into mass graves. But this biological catastrophe was likely born from a natural one. Right before the plague erupted, a massive volcanic eruption, possibly from an unknown volcano, pumped vast quantities of ash and sulfur into the planet's atmosphere. This veil of particulates reflected sunlight back into space, triggering a period of abrupt global cooling. The result was a series of devastating crop failures and famines across the empire. Starving, malnourished populations are the perfect breeding ground for disease, and as people migrated in search of food, they carried the plague with them along every Roman road and trade route. The empire's greatest strength, its interconnectedness, became its greatest vulnerability. The plague's impact was a cascade of systemic failures. It killed millions, including a huge number of soldiers, crippling the Roman army at a time when it faced relentless pressure on the German and Persian frontiers. Farmers died, leaving fields untilled and exacerbating the food crisis. The economy seized up as trade halted and tax revenues evaporated. This multi-front collapse plunged the empire into the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of civil war, economic chaos, and fragmentation where the empire nearly split into 3 separate states. But perhaps the most profound damage was to the Roman spirit. Traditional pagan gods seemed powerless to stop the suffering, while Christian communities who organized care for the sick and offered a promise of salvation saw their numbers and influence swell. The plague acted as a threat multiplier, taking every existing weakness in the Roman system, from military overstretch to religious doubt, and amplifying it 100-fold. It demonstrated that a society does not need to be struck by a meteor to fall apart. Sometimes a change in the climate, followed by a single germ, is enough to push a superpower to the brink. This dynamic of a natural trigger unleashing a social avalanche is one we will see again as we journey to the Americas, where a golden age was about to meet a sudden, chilling end. A volcano in the Americas unleashed a fury that would reshape a continent. In the middle of the 5th century, the Ilopango volcano in what is now El Salvador detonated with a force that dwarfs many better-known eruptions. This was the Tierra Blanca Jovan event, a cataclysm that tore the sky open and rained devastation across Central America. The volcano ejected a colossal volume of ash, a suffocating blanket that settled over an area of 10,000 square kilometers. This was not a light dusting that would wash away with the next rain. It was a thick, concrete-like layer of gray death that smothered everything in its path. The fertile lands of the southern Maya, a region of thriving villages and early cultural development, were instantly transformed into a sterile moonscape. The ash poisoned the rivers, buried the crops, and made the very air unbreathable. For the people living there, the world did not just end metaphorically, it ended literally in a matter of days. Their home was rendered utterly uninhabitable, not for a season, but for generations. This created a wave of human displacement on an almost unimaginable scale. Thousands upon thousands of Maya had no choice but to abandon their ancestral lands forever. They became refugees in their own world, trekking north in a desperate search for a place where the earth could once again support life. This great exodus funneled a massive, concentrated population into the lowland regions of the Yucatan Peninsula. Imagine the social pressure of this sudden influx. The existing communities in the lowlands, places like Tikal and Calakmul, were suddenly inundated with new people, new labor, and new ideas. This was not a gentle merging of cultures. It was a demographic explosion that supercharged the region. The newcomers brought their knowledge, their traditions, and their desperate need to build a new life. This injection of human capital and the fierce competition for resources and power acted as a catalyst. It fueled an intense period of construction, warfare, and artistic achievement. The relatively simple chiefdoms of the lowlands were forced to evolve rapidly into the powerful, rival city-states we now associate with the classic Maya Golden Age. The soaring pyramids of Tikal and the intricate palaces of Calakmul were, in a very real sense, built upon the ashes of a southern homeland. So while we marvel at the intellectual triumph of the Maya, with their precise calendars and majestic architecture, we must also recognize that this fluorescence was born from a desperate flight for survival. A single geological event did not destroy the Maya. Instead, it forced them to migrate, concentrate, and ultimately create one of the most brilliant and tragic civilizations of the ancient world. Just as one empire was attempting to rise from the ashes of the old, the planet delivered another brutal lesson in humility. In the year 541, a volcanic eruption of staggering magnitude, its exact location still debated by scientists, tore a hole in the sky. The immense cloud of ash and aerosols it injected into the stratosphere acted like a global sunshade, filtering out the sun's warmth. The result was a volcanic winter that lasted for years. Across the entire northern hemisphere, temperatures plummeted. Summers never arrived, and frosts touched fields even in July. Crops failed from Gaul to China, but the impact was felt most acutely in the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. This was the realm of Emperor Justinian, a ruler of boundless ambition who had already begun reconquering the lost western provinces of Italy, North Africa, and Spain. His dream was nothing less than the full restoration of the Roman Empire. Then the grain ships from Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, began arriving with half-empty holds. Famine gripped the great capital of Constantinople. The population, already weakened and malnourished from years of poor harvests, was a tinderbox waiting for a single spark. That spark arrived in the form of a rat flea. From the ports of Egypt, the bubonic plague made its landfall. It moved with terrifying speed through the crowded, starving city. Victims developed violent fevers and the grotesque, painful swellings called buboes in their lymph nodes, often in the groin or armpits. Many were dead within a week. The streets filled with corpses, and the death toll became so overwhelming that the living resorted to stacking bodies inside towers and on the roofs of forts, leaving them to rot in the open air. At its peak, the plague was killing 10,000 people every single day in Constantinople alone. The empire lost perhaps a quarter of its entire population. This was more than a demographic catastrophe. It was an economic and military death blow. The treasury, dependent on a vast population of taxpayers, was emptied. Justinian's magnificent armies, on the verge of total victory in Italy, were decimated by disease and could no longer be paid or reinforced. His grand project of reunification collapsed overnight. The dream of a restored Rome died not on the battlefield, but in the sickbeds of a plague-ridden empire. This dual catastrophe of climate and disease marked the true, final end of the ancient world. The political and cultural unity of the Mediterranean, a reality for nearly 1,000 years, was shattered beyond repair. The focus of European history shifted decisively northward, away from the crippled Byzantines, and the stage was set for the fragmented, localized world of the Middle Ages. A single germ carried on the winds of a volcanic winter had redirected the entire course of Western civilization. Even the most brilliant minds can be broken by a relentless sky. For nearly 2 centuries, the classic Maya civilization had flourished, its city-states connected by a shared culture of astronomy, art, and immense pyramids that pierced the jungle canopy. Then, around the year 800, the rains began to hold back. This was not a typical dry season, but something far more sinister. A series of megadroughts, some lasting for decades, began to choke the region. We know this from the silent testimony of ancient stalagmites deep within caves and sediment layers at the bottom of lakes. These natural archives reveal a stark pattern of dramatically reduced rainfall, a climatic shift that turned the Maya heartland into a tinderbox of desperation. The intricate agricultural system, dependent on seasonal rains to fill reservoirs and nourish their milpa fields of maize and beans, collapsed. Famine began to stalk the land. What happens to a society when the water simply stops coming? The Maya answer was written in conflict and collapse. the once powerful city-states, previously bound by alliances and trade, turned on each other. Inscriptions on stone monuments, which once recorded the births and victories of god-kings, now tell of escalating warfare. Raids were no longer for capturing nobles for ritual sacrifice, but for seizing the most precious resource of all, food and water. The very rulers who were believed to mediate with the gods, who guaranteed the cycles of rain and sun, were now seen as failures. Their divine authority evaporated along with the water in their reservoirs. One by one, the great ceremonial centers were abandoned. The royal palace at Helike fell silent. The sculptors of Kapon laid down their tools for the last time. The population did not vanish entirely, but they voted with their feet, abandoning the magnificent inland cities for the more reliable water sources along the coasts. The brilliant cultural flame of the classic period, with its complex calendar and hieroglyphic writing, flickered and was largely extinguished. The collapse of the Maya is a haunting lesson in the limits of adaptation. They were not a primitive people, they were brilliant hydrologists who built elaborate canal systems and reservoirs, but their technology and their social structure were designed for a specific climate, one that changed in a way they could not outlast. It was a slow-motion unraveling, a civilization not shattered by a single blow, but gradually starved and fractured by a thirst that lasted generations. This pattern of internal collapse, triggered by environmental stress, would soon be mirrored across the globe as another empire faced a climatic threat that arrived not with drought, but with an unending winter. The legend of Yu the Great begins with a world submerged. For generations, ancient Chinese texts recount, the Yellow River burst its banks with a fury that seemed endless, swallowing the plains and trapping communities on isolated high ground. This was not a single season of high water, but a persistent, civilization-threatening deluge that lasted for decades, perhaps even centuries. It was a force of chaos, turning the cradle of Chinese culture into a vast, uninhabitable swamp. The social order of the time, likely a collection of small, competing chiefdoms, was powerless against such a sustained assault from nature. Their world was literally dissolving into the murky waters. The hero who emerged from this chaos was not a warrior with a sword, but an engineer with a plan. Yu was tasked with taming the flood, and he approached the problem not by fighting the water, but by guiding it. Instead of simply building dikes to contain the river, a method that had failed his father, he organized a massive, years-long project to dredge new channels and deepen existing riverbeds. He created a network of canals that gave the raging waters a path to drain safely into the sea. The stories say he labored for 13 years, his hands covered in calluses, his body caked in mud, passing his own home 3 times without ever stepping inside. His success was more than an engineering triumph, it was a political revolution. By coordinating the labor of countless communities across the region, Yu did something unprecedented. He demonstrated that a centralized authority, one capable of organizing on a grand scale, was the only solution to a problem that individual villages could never solve alone. His victory over the waters did not just make the land livable again, it made the case for a unified state. In gratitude, the people are said to have offered him the mandate of heaven, and he became the founding emperor of the Xia dynasty, China's first legendary ruling house. Whether the Xia were a historical reality or a powerful myth, the story of the Great Flood reveals a profound truth. A natural disaster of immense proportions did not just destroy, it created. It forged the very idea of Chinese kingship, establishing that the right to rule was earned not through birth, but through the demonstrated ability to control the environment for the good of all. The mandate of heaven was first tested not in battle, but in the mud of a receding flood. This pattern of creation from catastrophe would find a stark contrast in the fate of another civilization, one that relied on the desert for its protection, only to be betrayed by the shifting sands. The tragedy of Pompeii was not the first time Vesuvius would erase a world. Nearly 2,000 years before that famous catastrophe, the mountain unleashed an even greater fury. The Avellino eruption around 1800 before the Common Era did not just darken the sky, it rewrote the future of the Italian peninsula. A meter of searing volcanic ash fell across the fertile plains of Campania, a suffocating blanket that instantly entombed Bronze Age villages and their surrounding farmland. The land was rendered a sterile, grey wasteland, incapable of supporting life for generations. In the ash, archaeologists have found the ghostly traces of that final, desperate day. Footprints perfectly preserved tell a silent story of panic. A group of people, men, women, and children sprinting away from the inferno, their steps captured forever in the very material that was sealing their fate. It is a prehistoric Pompeii, a single moment of flight frozen in time. The entire region was completely evacuated, not for years but for centuries. The demographic and cultural clock was reset to zero. This forced hiatus had a profound downstream effect. The development of complex societies in one of Italy's most promising regions was put on hold, delaying the emergence of the organized Italic tribes who would eventually build the foundations of Roman culture. The timeline was permanently altered. The world that would later produce the Roman Republic was born from this long silence, a civilization that rose only after the mountain's fury had finally settled back into sleep. The fire and ash of Thura's eruption did not simply fall back to the sea. They punched high into the stratosphere, creating a shield of sulfur dioxide aerosols that wrapped around the planet. This invisible veil reflected sunlight back into space, and the world grew colder. The volcanic winter that followed was not confined to the Mediterranean. Its chill was felt across the globe, a silent, creeping disaster written in the rings of ancient trees. In the bogs of Ireland, oak trees recorded years of stunted growth, their rings squeezed tight by unseasonable frosts that killed spring blossoms and withered summer grains. Similar evidence from ancient North American forests tells the same story of a deep, persistent cold snap precisely aligned with the Thura eruption. This was a planetary event. While the Minoans on Crete were dealing with tsunamis and ashfall, a farmer in the Yellow River Valley might have watched his millet crop fail under a pallid, cool sun, never knowing that a mountain on an island he had never heard of was the cause. The disruption to agriculture would have been immense, triggering famines and migrations far from the eruption's sight or sound. This is the ultimate lesson of Thura's global reach. Ancient civilizations lived in a world they believed was vast and disconnected, where the gods of one land held no power in another. Yet a single geological event in the Aegean Sea could send ripples through the climate system that starved communities in China and stunted forests in Europe. They experienced the consequences of a connected planet without ever understanding the mechanism, a global village bound by an invisible thread of atmospheric chemistry. It is a humbling reminder of our shared vulnerability to the Earth's most powerful forces, a concept we can now measure with scientific precision, but one that our ancestors could only endure as a mystery written in the cold and the hunger. While volcanic fire reshaped the Mediterranean, a different kind of winter descended on the far side of the world. Around 1600 before the Common Era, Alaska's Aniakchak volcano exploded with a force that ranks among the most powerful of the last 10,000 years. The eruption column punched high into the atmosphere, where prevailing winds caught its cargo of fine gray ash and carried it for hundreds of miles across northwestern North America. This was not a localized event. A blanket of abrasive, acidic tephra settled over vast stretches of territory, a silent, suffocating rain that transformed the landscape in a matter of days. For the indigenous societies living in this fragile Arctic environment, the fallout was an existential catastrophe. Their entire world was built on a delicate balance between the people, the caribou herds, and the low-lying tundra plants like lichen that flourished in the brief summer. The thick layer of volcanic ash smothered this vital vegetation, destroying the primary food source for the great migrating caribou. The animals, their grazing grounds buried and their lungs choked with dust, either died off in huge numbers or altered their ancient migration routes to avoid the devastated zones. Imagine the profound disorientation of a hunter who has known the land his entire life. The trails his people have followed for generations are gone, buried under a featureless gray powder. The familiar sight of caribou moving across the horizon has vanished, replaced by an eerie silence. The very tools of survival, from the plants used for medicine to the berries gathered in autumn, were now poisoned or buried. This was not a disaster they could outwait. The tephra layer would not simply wash away, it would persist for years, leaching toxins into the soil and water. Famine was immediate and inescapable. The only choice was to move, to abandon ancestral homelands and embark on a desperate search for untouched lands where the caribou still roamed. These forced migrations would have triggered waves of social upheaval as displaced groups encountered others, leading to conflict over scarce resources or, perhaps, to new alliances and cultural exchanges born from shared desperation. The archaeological record here is quieter, written not in crumbled palaces but in the subtle shifts in tool styles and settlement patterns across the Arctic. Yet the story it tells is just as profound. The Aniakchak eruption reminds us with brutal clarity that these planet-altering events were never exclusive to the so-called cradles of civilization. A volcano erupting in a remote corner of Alaska could erase entire ways of life, forcing human societies to adapt, migrate, or perish. This was a global phenomenon, a shared vulnerability that connected every human community, from the marble palaces of the Aegean to the skin tents of the Arctic tundra. The very ground beneath the North Sea gave way. In a single, convulsive event around 6,200 years before the Common Era, a staggering section of the continental shelf off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, collapsed into the abyss. The sheer scale is difficult to comprehend, an underwater avalanche of sediment larger than many modern countries. The displacement of all that earth and water generated a tsunami of almost unimaginable force, a wall of water that raced across the North Atlantic basin. It slammed into the coastlines of Norway, Iceland, and Scotland with terrifying fury, but its most devastating impact was on a place that is now only a memory on the seafloor, a lost world called Doggerland. This was not a minor land bridge, but a vast, low-lying plain, rich with forests, rivers, and marshes, a fertile hunting ground for Mesolithic tribes. For generations, their ancestors had walked from what is now the Netherlands all the way to the east coast of England. Britain was not an island, but simply the westernmost region of a European continent. The Storegga tsunami did not just flood the coastline, it delivered a death blow to this entire world. The surge of seawater would have swept miles inland, scouring the landscape, drowning forests, and wiping out the animal herds that the human populations depended on. It was a sudden, violent drowning of a country. The survivors, those who lived on the higher grounds that would become the islands we know today, watched as their world shrank before their eyes. The Great Plain never recovered. Sea levels, already rising since the end of the last ice age, finished their work, and the North Sea consumed Doggerland forever. This event forced a profound and permanent change in human geography. The people of Britain were now cut off, their connection to the continental mainland severed by the waves. This isolation became a crucible, with migration and easy exchange of ideas now a thing of the past. The communities in Britain were forced to develop on their own unique trajectory, adapting to their new island reality and laying the foundational stones for a distinct cultural identity that would echo for millennia. A single geological collapse did not just change a coastline, it created the conditions for an island nation story to begin. Far to the south of the erupting volcano, a new pharaoh was establishing his rule over a reunified Egypt. Ahmose I had just expelled the foreign Hyksos rulers, founding the glorious new kingdom, an era of imperial power and prosperity. Yet his reign began under a sky that turned against the earth. A stone inscription known as the Tempest Stele, erected by Ahmose himself, describes a period of terrifying chaos. It tells of a storm of such unnatural violence that the skies were darkened for days. The roar of thunder was louder than the cries of the masses, and torrential rains and floods devastated the land, even breaking down the royal tombs. For the Egyptians, this was not mere bad weather. It was a cosmological event, a sign that the divine order had been fractured at the very moment of the kingdom's rebirth. Could this have been the distant echo of Thura? The timeline is strikingly coincidental. The massive injection of volcanic ash and aerosols into the atmosphere would have disrupted weather patterns across the entire region, creating the very conditions of prolonged darkness and violent, unseasonal storms described on the stele. Furthermore, while the tsunami's direct wave would have dissipated long before reaching the Egyptian coast, the seismic sea wave generated by the caldera's collapse could have triggered a meteotsunami, a wave driven by abrupt changes in air pressure, capable of causing sudden, inexplicable flooding in the Nile Delta. The Egyptian scribes, with no concept of a volcano 1,000 miles away, interpreted these events through their own worldview. The darkness, the storms, the flooding, all of it was recorded as a divine tempest, a trial sent by the gods that the pharaoh had to overcome to prove his worthiness. This connection transforms the Tempest Stele from a simple royal monument into something far more profound. It becomes a piece of geological testimony, a cryptic entry in the human record that captures the moment a planetary event reverberated through a civilization that never even knew its source. The disaster that shattered the Minoan world was powerful enough to register as a divine omen at the dawn of the Egyptian Empire, a stark reminder that in the ancient world, a single geological event could write its story in multiple languages, on multiple shores, forever linking the fates of peoples who had never met. The lifeblood of Mesopotamia could change its mind. At the height of the Uruk period, the world's first great cities thrived in southern Iraq, their power and population swelling from the predictable bounty of the Euphrates River. Canals channeled its water to fields of barley, and its current carried trading ships between bustling urban centers. This was the dawn of urban civilization, an experiment in living together on a grand scale. Then the river began to move. Over decades, the Euphrates, in its slow, meandering dance across the flat plain, gradually shifted its main channel. It was not a sudden cataclysm, but a creeping geological inevitability. Imagine the growing dread as the canal intakes, once submerged, began to poke above the waterline. The network of irrigation ditches that fed the fields of a city like Uruk itself slowly ran dry. The fertile land began to crack and bleach under the sun. The river was not gone, it had simply decided to flow elsewhere, leaving its former partners stranded. This was a disaster of geography, a slow-motion abandonment that no army could fight and no king could command. A city's port, once a hub of commerce, became a useless slab of masonry in the middle of a dust bowl. The economic and social logic that had drawn thousands of people together in these dense urban centers simply unraveled. Without water, there was no agriculture. Without agriculture, there was no surplus food to feed priests, administrators, and potters. The social pyramid collapsed because its base, the irrigated field, had vanished. One by one, the great cities of the south were abandoned, their populations dispersing back into smaller, more mobile tribal groups. The brilliant flame of early urbanism in the region flickered and dimmed. This collapse forced a profound reorganization. The center of gravity for Mesopotamian civilization shifted northward, following the capricious river, where new cities would eventually rise. The lesson of the Yurok period is a humbling one. It reveals that a civilization's greatest asset can also be its single point of failure. They had built a world entirely dependent on the consistent flow of one river, and when that river chose a new path, it took their entire world with it. This silent hydrological betrayal proves that the ground beneath our feet is never truly solid, and the maps we draw are only temporary. A cold deeper than any winter settled over northern Europe. Around 1,000 years before the Common Era, Iceland's Mount Hekla, a volcano now known as the Gateway to Hell, erupted with a fury that echoed across the continent. It spewed a vast cloud of fine, acidic ash high into the atmosphere, a gritty haze that dimmed the sun for years. This was not a simple dusting. The tephra that settled across the land was a poison for the soil, and the persistent cloud overhead triggered a volcanic winter that stole the warmth from the growing season. Summers became brief and cool, and frosts arrived early, withering the delicate shoots of barley and wheat in the fields. For the farming communities of Central Europe, this was a slow-moving catastrophe. One failed harvest could be endured, two would bring starvation. But when the cold and the acid rain persisted for years, it became a question of survival. Their homeland could no longer support them. This prolonged environmental crisis is now seen as the Great Push, the catalyst that set entire peoples in motion. These were the Proto-Celtic tribes, and with their old world dying around them, they had no choice but to seek a new one. They began to migrate, a slow but relentless human tide flowing outward from their heartland. Family by family, clan by clan, they moved west and south, carrying their language, their traditions, and their iron-working skills into new territories. This was not a single invasion, but a centuries-long process of infiltration and settlement. A domino effect of displacement and resettlement triggered by a distant volcano. Their journeys ultimately defined the cultural landscape of Europe for centuries to come. They pressed into Gaul, into the Iberian Peninsula, and across the sea to the British Isles and Ireland. The world they found there was transformed by their arrival. They brought with them the roots of the Gaelic, Brythonic, and Gaulish languages, and their distinct artistic style with its intricate spirals and knots would become synonymous with the Celtic identity. So the next time you envision the ancient Druids of Ireland or the fierce warriors of Gaul, remember the invisible thread that leads back to a volcanic explosion in Iceland. A change in the climate, written in ash and hunger, set the stage for the Celts to claim their place in history, proving once more that the boundaries of cultures were often drawn by the whims of the earth itself. Even legends whisper a kernel of truth. The city of Ubar, celebrated in the Quran and Arabian folklore as Iram of the Pillars, was a place of fabled wealth, a crucial hub for the caravan routes that carried precious frankincense across the desert. Its sudden disappearance was attributed to a dramatic act of divine retribution, a punishment for the arrogance of its people, who were swallowed by the sands in a single night. For centuries, it was considered a myth, a poetic lesson in hubris. Then, in the 1990s, archaeologists using satellite imagery and ground surveys identified a likely site in modern-day Oman. What they found was not a city crushed by a vengeful god, but a settlement betrayed by the very ground it stood upon. The ruins were not simply buried, they were collapsed into a massive sinkhole. The evidence points to a slow-moving, human-amplified disaster. The city was built atop a large limestone cavern, a natural reservoir of fossil water. To sustain their population and their lucrative frankincense trade, the people of Yuba relentlessly drew from this underground source. They were essentially mining the water, dropping the water table until the cavern's roof could no longer support its own weight. The collapse would have been catastrophic and sudden. The central part of the city, its heart and its foundation, plummeted into the earth, dragging temples, homes, and lives into the abyss. In the aftermath, the relentless desert sands, always waiting at the edges, swept in to cover the ruins, completing the process of erasure. This final disaster stands as a profound metaphor. The people of Yuba did not know they were living on a fragile ceiling. Their survival and their prosperity depended on the resource that was, piece by piece, removing the floor from under them. Their story is a cautionary tale that echoes across the millennia, a stark reminder that the most dangerous catastrophes are often those we engineer ourselves through the slow, unthinking consumption of the resources that sustain us. It is a final, haunting lesson from the ancient world, one that resonates with a chilling clarity in our own time. From the ash of Thura to the shifting sands of Yuba, these 20 events paint a single, inescapable picture. Our history is not a separate story from that of the planet, but a single, intertwined narrative. Time and again, the ground has shaken, the sky has darkened, and the climate has shifted, rewriting human destiny in the process. These forces toppled empires that seemed eternal, redirected the great rivers of migration, and brought golden ages to an abrupt and chilling end. Yet, in the wreckage, they also forged new beginnings, forcing innovation and scattering the seeds of future cultures. The silent collapse of the Indus Valley, the desperate migrations of the Maya, the fiscal bleeding of the Han Dynasty, all speak to a fragile balance between human ambition and planetary reality. As we now face our own period of profound environmental change, these ancient catastrophes are more than just stories. They are a deep time archive of lessons in resilience, in adaptation, and in the grave consequences of ignoring our fundamental relationship with the natural world. The past makes one thing abundantly clear: civilizations are not permanent structures. They are a continuous, delicate dialogue with the earth, a conversation we must learn to listen to with far greater care. Thank you for joining this journey through time. If these stories of survival and transformation resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more explorations into the mysteries of our past.